I'm really happy to have Fieke Jansen here today. She is a PhD candidate at Data Justice Lab at Cardiff University, so it's one of the few external talks we have in the series. She's working on the impact of data-driven decision-making in European police forces, quite interesting, and she wrote this interesting blog post where I shared the link already a couple of minutes ago, where she discusses essentially where, when, if ever, predictive policing is effective, fair, and legitimate, and I'm really happy that she's going to share her thoughts here today. Fieke, the floor is yours.
Okay, great. Let's first try to share my slides. Yes.
Yep, looks good.
So, okay, great. So first, thanks for inviting me. As I was introduced, I'm Fieke and I'm a PhD student at the Data Justice Lab. But actually, before I went into academia, I spent 10 years working in the digital rights fields, looking at the intersection of sort of human rights, technology, and how this is impacting journalists and human rights defenders. So I come at it from a quite usually practical angle. And in my PhD, I'm looking at sort of the impact of data-driven decision-making within police forces and how this is impacting sort of our society. And from this, it sort of already originated that a lot of research is being done in the US about this topic that is assumed to be able to be transposed to like other places like Europe. And I'm challenging this notion a bit by saying like we have to contextualize it and understand how it's being implemented. And sort of the blog post, there's a new sort of online platform called About Intel, and that wants to be the European voice on surveillance. So they asked a range of people to write a reflection on sort of the question about when, if ever, is predictive policing effective, fair, and legitimate. And the blog post was my response to it. And it's sort of based on my work currently with police. So I'm doing interviews and I'm interacting with with police officers who are implementing technology in the Netherlands, the UK, but also in other parts of Europe. And I actually hate this picture, but this picture of sort of a Minority Report is something that keeps on coming back when we talk about predictive policing. So I put it in there because this is the imaginary that people have when we talk about it. Let's see if I can move to my next slide. No, wait. I'm gonna try it again. Yes, now it works. So I first want to start about what is predictive policing and what are the dominant issues that people have highlighted around this technology. And then I will talk about sort of the need to contextualize it and the points I raised in my blog post. So first, predictive policing. I mean, this is an image of the Amsterdam developed predictive policing tool, CAS, where it sort of shows different areas of the city where it's most likely to have like burglaries and robberies are most likely to happen in the next 2 weeks. And if you're familiar with Amsterdam and you see it, actually like it's not a surprise that these places are highlighted and other places aren't highlighted. So maybe there's like also a link between predictive policing and what the Dutch call like common farmer sense. But what is predictive policing? So it is actually like using historic and real-time data to predict when and where a crime is most likely to occur and who is most likely to engage in or become a victim of criminal activities. And I think this is also the biggest misconception, is that there's like one predictive policing tool, but there's actually a distinction between two. One is really focused on the location of where crime will most likely occur, and the other one is really focused on a person. So either a victim or a perpetrator of a criminal activity, also from the logic that victims have a larger likelihood to become future criminals. And first, I will explore a bit about the predictive location models before I go into the predictive person models. So the predictive location models, the image I just showed, there's basically two main models on which this is happening. The first is a near repeat model, which comes from sort of Predpol, which is like the Predpol model is based on this. And they actually said we can model sort of crime like we model earthquakes. And for this, we just need sort of historic police data that gives us information about the crime type, the date and time it happened, and the location. And considering that sort of if a burglary happens in one area of town, it will most likely also trigger another burglary like in the near future in that same area of town. So this is a bit the logic behind it. And as you can see, there's very little data points in this near repeat model. Then there's other models that say we need more data to actually predict it. So we need crime data about what time of crime has happened, when and where. But we also need data about like weather, events, and holidays, because this will really determine an increase or a decrease in high impact crime. And just to make sure that, like, just to go back, all of these models are focused on high impact crime, which is burglary, robbery, and theft. So it's a very specific crime type. And they say like when there's holidays, sort of burglaries increase, but also sort of when the winter's coming and the nights get longer, burglaries also increase. Then they also use population data, like the one that was developed in Amsterdam uses socioeconomic data from our center, from sort of the government agency who collects all of this. And they also use geospatial data like the distance to a highway, because the closer it is to sort of a road that leads to the highway, the higher likelihood that this area will be impacted by crime. So the second time-space model, sort of like police data plus, which creates a lot of like additional variables. And we hear a lot about sort of predictive policing models used in the US. But as you can see, sort of, I made a small overview. There's a lot of different sort of models being tried and tested in Europe as well, where we have the UK police primarily like sort of buying off-the-shelf products like Predpol, Palantir, Azeva, who've been like tried and tested and sometimes implemented like with the Kent police for over maybe 2-3 years, but most of them been halted because it's too costly. And so they're trying to build in-house models. The crime anticipation system in the Netherlands is built in-house in Amsterdam and has been now rolled out across the country, whereas Germany always chooses for a different flavor, and their pre-COP, pre-MAP, and KLB operative are all developed in combination with universities. But it doesn't just stick to these countries. Like in Italy, they're also using a specific version of a predictive policing model. So this is just to demonstrate that it's like vastly sort of tested and experimented with, and often actually the status is unknown because they use it as a pilot. They start implementing it as a pilot, and then sort of we don't really know if it stops or if it becomes like an official program or how it's actually being implemented. And in the UK, we happen to know it because I think Liberty, they did a lot of freedom of information requests that showed that some programs had been halted. And then we have sort of the predicting of the perpetrator, of the victim of crime. So sort of predictive policing on the person. And I think the most known case of this was in the US, where they predicted who was most likely to become a victim or a perpetrator of a gun crime. And they sent people a letter saying, according to our data, in the near future, you will be subjected, like you will become either a victim or a perpetrator of a gun crime. And then they either didn't act, or they sent a lot of police to their doorstep. So it became very punitive. But in talking sort of police who are implementing these programs in the Netherlands and the UK, we see that it's actually being used for 3 different things. So the one is to analyze sort of who is showing concerning behavior. And this usually happens sort of for people who are not perpetrators yet, but these are like minor showing concerning behavior. So there's a small increase in the number of incidents, like theft in convenience stores, but also getting into fights at school grounds or on the streets, that raises concerns. but they don't expect the police to actually act on it, but they want to refer these people to other public institutions who then should take a closer look at it, like, for instance, Child Protective Services. Then there's an analysis, for instance, who belongs to a predefined target group. Here we can see that politically certain crime areas have been labeled as like a priority. So in Amsterdam, there was an increase in violent robberies of jewelry stores. And then the then mayor said, we need to do something about it. These are kids who the normal sort of criminal justice system approach doesn't deter them from engaging in crime, and things are becoming more violent. So we want to like have the top 600 of kids or minors who are like young adults who are associated to this type of crime to go into a different trajectory with more sort of increased engagement in public institutions to deter them from continuing in a life of crime, or managing sort of that their actions become less, sort of have less impact on society. And these two are really like low-level data analysis. So they basically look at crime data for a number of variables, and then they sort of try to identify who belongs to a specific group or who's showing concerning behavior. In the UK, they're actually experimenting with things more machine learning, where they're looking at a predefined target group. So they're saying like everybody who has done, who's engaged in domestic violence or in high impact crime. And we want to know when somebody is escalating from low harm to high harm crimes. So say, if it's in the case of domestic violence, it is like a low harm crime would be maybe minor stalking, and a high harm crime would be actually murder or physical harm. And they they are looking back at data to see if they can predict when this escalation is happening from this low to high harm crime, so that they can intervene preemptively. And I think this third one is very distinctive, and it's also very distinctive to the UK, because the rest of the sort of the local European police departments are not experimenting with machine learning in this way. And so here's an overview of sort of different predictive policing programs on the individual that are happening. So a very known one is the gang matrix. And it's actually to identify people who are belonging to gangs. It's temporarily suspended by the Data Protection Agency in the UK, the ICO, because it had a lot of discriminatory elements in it, which I will address later on. But there's, for instance, also NDAS, which is trying to analyze sort of historic UK police data to identify victims and perpetrators related to gun and knife crime and modern slavery. And what you see if you look across these programs of what's different with predictive location policing, that this actually goes across a range of police priorities, whereas the location policing is really looking at sort of high impact crime. The other ones range really from gun crime to gang violence to domestic abuse to also high impact crime. But the same logic also applies to terrorism, for instance. So in Germany, the federal police has Radar IT, which is a similar type of sort of scoring mechanisms in which they give individuals, like a predefined target group, a risk score about what their likelihood is to escalate to a violent terrorist offense. And the interesting part here is that while most of sort of these the other programs from the gang matrix to ProKit, that all is on police data, existing police data. With Radar IT, they have defined sort of a group of people on a watch list, a terrorist watch list. And what they do is that they identified 60 psychological questions, and they do this to they then observe sort of these individuals on the watch list and have police officers answer these questions. And this is sort of the input for the data-driven risk score. So the variety is a lot bigger than the location policing. Now, there's also a few dominant critiques about predictive policing. One is that it actually reinforces over-policing of specific communities. And here is an example of location policing. So Lum and Isaacs did this really interesting experiment where Predpol, one of the major location predictive policing software, they published their algorithm in a academic journal. And what Lum and Isaacs did is they rebuilt the algorithm and then tested it out on different kind of data to sort of see if there's a negative feedback loop. And the idea being here, sort of the main critique being here, is that historic police data in the US is very biased towards communities of color. And as such, like if you then run an algorithm over it, this will then reinforce sort of the bias in it. And seeing as Lum and Isaacs didn't have access to police data because they wouldn't open it up for their research, they actually did it on the basis of data about like statistics about drug use. So where you first see sort of like the first map is about sort of data that was published about the arrest related to drug use, which is all in one area of Oakland, which is where sort of predominantly most communities of color live. And the second map to the right is that you see is actually the drug use within Oakland on the basis of sort of the health information that is public. And you can see that how sort of the arrests are happening in one place, especially in sort of areas with community of colors. Actually, the drug use is like fairly evenly distributed across entire Oakland. So their argument is that if you base it only on, if you base these predictive policing programs only on police data, you will reinforce sort of existing biases, both in sort of the data, but also in the policing practice. And more fundamental critiques about predictive policing have been is that on the one hand, it changes the nature of policing from reactionary to preemptive, which then has a lot of consequences. So where first the police will be called up and said, oh, a crime has happened, they will come to your house, like take notes and do their investigation to try to find the perpetrator. It's now being done more preemptively. So police strategically position sort of their police officers on the street, on specific street corners, or ask them to walk specific streets to actually deter burglaries from happening, for instance. So the assumption is that actually using these predictive policing tools will change the nature of policing, which is to some extent true, but also there's some issues around it because the police have been engaging with these types of preemptive warnings and preempting sort of placing, only it's never been directed by a tool like a predictive policing tool. And the other sort of main critique is that it actually shapes the political rationalities and further entrenches the centrality of data. So Eckberts looked at sort of the use of predictive policing tools within Germany, and he found that while actually it might not decrease crime rates within the places it would test it, what it did do was sort of awaken the police to understand sort of the importance of data and what they could do with it, sort of power within it, and then also sort of their drive to collect more and more data to be able to then use it again. So in the end, it might not have like had any impact on sort of deterrence of crime or crime rates, but it definitely had an impact on how police approached sort of data and how they wanted to use it. And so on the basis of these more fundamental things, people are saying, well, maybe we should see predictive policing tools as a tool not to like predict where crime is happening, but as a tool to predict where arrests are most likely to take place. But also, I think there's something more fundamental to it because as data sort of privileges correlation over causation, Andreevich argued that it's more likely to give police officers a tool to manage crime instead of changing the conditions that lead to crime. Because as we know, it's sort of like we can see crime as sort of an individual flaw. So something that I do as a person because I'm not an upstanding citizen, or we can see it as a result of an unequal distribution of power. So maybe somebody grew up in the wrong neighborhood, maybe they didn't have access to the same schooling, maybe they lived in a sort of poverty, had the wrong friends. Like there's a whole range of sort of like conditions that can lead to a life of crime. Whereas if we look through the lens of predictive policing, we just see like a person who has a specific rap sheet or who did certain types of crime, and we don't actually understand that what led him to doing this. So there's like different approaches to policing. And then I go now to the need to contextualize predictive policing. And sort of what I was arguing in the discussion prompt on about Intel, which I repeat again, it's like, when, if ever, is predictive policing effective, fair, and legitimate? And what is the role of data reliability in this? And what we see is that a lot of like research started looking at these tools. So also Lam and Isaac looked at the tools, saying sort of the data that goes into these tools is biased, and then the tool only sort of further enforces this bias. There's also people looking at it from a regulatory perspective, saying, are police allowed to use data under what conditions, and sort of what is the agency you have as an individual to sort of to gain access to your data or to challenge any decisions made on sort of data-driven decision making. But I am also specifically interested in looking at police and the context they operated in, and sort of why are they turning to these tools, and what are they actually doing? Because a lot of it is driven by imaginaries from the US, and then when we actually see how it's being implemented in Europe, it's implemented differently. So this is sort of what triggered my blog post around it. So maybe the first question about location policing, is it actually a tool to reduce crime? And what we see is that maybe they are more accurate at predicting where an arrest will take place, or maybe even where crime will take place. But there's no sort of numbers that are indicating that crime is actually reducing because the use of this technology. Well, we're seeing that high impact crime, especially in sort of the Netherlands, Belgium, Germany, and other European places, has been decreasing for the last 10 years. And this is probably more to do with the fact that sort of consumer electronics are becoming cheaper, and we can't really sell them. Like, if you steal them, you don't get the same return on investment if you want to sell them. That people's locks are becoming stronger. So there's probably a lot of other contextual variables why actually high impact crime is reducing, and it cannot be attributed actually to this tool. Whereas most police actually claim there's a success in it. Then what I was quite astounded about when I was talking to the Dutch and the Belgian police, who are sort of in the Netherlands, who also built this crime anticipation system, is that they acknowledge that the crime rates, so the high impact crime rates, are actually too low for these tools to work in real time. So what they were made for actually. And like in the best case scenario, how they use it is that they actually inform those people who make the schedules for police, like how many police in what area at what time. So it's one of the pieces of information they get once every 2 weeks to make a schedule on it. So I was quite fascinated why, if these crime rates are so low, too low for these tools to actually work, why do we keep on investing in them and building them and sort of keep on implementing them? And even when there was no correlation between the use of these tools and reducing crime, and with the understanding that the crime rates were too low, the Dutch police still chose to, for instance, roll out the crime anticipation system that was built for Amsterdam across the entire country. And what you hear as well is that there's quite a lot of reluctance from officers on the street to use it, because in the testing phase of COS, the crime anticipation system, they sent some police officers out with a printed map, and sort of some of the responses were like, who's going to tell me where to walk? I know this like neighborhood very well. I know exactly who's who and who's a bit more problematic. So there was a lot of reluctance by police officers to have some data system tell them where to go. So I feel like within the context of Europe, it's primarily a support tool. And there's other interests why they keep on investing in it and keep on trying to roll it out. And one of it is actually it's an easy entry point to sort of innovate and become more data savvy, because like a police is a very bureaucratic organization, and they have a feeling they're missing out on the next century. So they feel like they really have to step it up, otherwise they miss the boat, and criminals will be able to use all these technologies that they won't be able to use. Then there's also like key individuals who are driving this within the police force because they either see it as a way to advance their career, or because they really believe that this will lead to better policing. So there's like different incentives for why actually these tools materialize within police and why they continue to invest in them, even though we know there's like, it hasn't been proven to reduce crime or actually to work. And then for sort of identifying the person, the perpetrator or a victim of crime, which is quite interesting, is that politically it's often the result of a moment of crisis. So the gang matrix got into effect after the 2011 riots in London. And then all of a sudden, the political leaders of both London, but also of the country said like, gang crime is a serious problem in the UK and we need to address it. So from that moment, all of a sudden, gang crime became a thing within policing that needed to be addressed. And sort of they needed to identify gang nominals. And they said, like, we do this by creating sort of like, by trying to identify who the perpetrators are. And what was interesting is like, there was like a lot of scrutiny on the gang matrix because it's very discriminatory. So in the eyes of the state, a gang member is somebody who's a young man, mostly with a black young man. And that in the boroughs in London in which they actually were implementing it, there were known Turkish gangs, and they didn't show up in this in the gang matrix because they didn't they didn't share the characteristics that the police created around like a gang nominal or somebody suspected of being a criminal. And in the Netherlands, we saw that the top 600 actually arose after all these violent burglaries in Amsterdam on the jewelry stores. And they were like, we need to do something. And sort of what is unique about sort of a lot of these person-based predictive policing models, and predictive is really between quotation marks because most of them are not that predictive, is that it's like a one government approach. So they sort of say that the traditional criminal justice approach hasn't worked, and that these individuals, so these young adults, are often anyway engaging with a range of sort of public institutions, from police to welfare to maybe child protective services. And so that we need to come up with a different way, and also take the responsibility as the government to not just like to coordinate all of our actions to take this person out of the criminal, sort of the criminal environment. And here, sort of what is interesting about this one government approach is that the risk is the basis of the sort of these data-driven predictive models for the individual. It is not necessarily tied to the individual. So it's not how risky this individual is, but it's often also like that this individual is at risk of falling in between the gaps of the public institutions. And if they can identify these people and work together, they will get them out of a life of crime, which is a very big assumption, by the way. And then the other thing that came up from talking to the police is that actually in the Netherlands, they weren't really sure what the role of police was in preemption. So they said that as an agency, they have like a unique position in society where they come into neighborhoods and into houses that other public authorities don't come into. So that also makes their data set very unique and robust, and they can see things that other public authorities can't see. So they see a role as indicating of where things are going wrong, but they don't necessarily see a role for themselves for taking action, where they say like preemption and taking action is often more sort of the responsibility of other public authorities, which I actually found interesting because there is a lot of debate about what is the role of police within preemption. And sort of this is also within in the bureaucracy itself. And then what I also liked about it is like they mentioned how the target group is often diffused. So when we talk about predictive policing models, we often talk about false positives and false negatives, and the impact of like having false positives and false negatives on the life of sort of targeted communities. And then talking to a person who works on one of these risk scores in the Netherlands, he basically said that it's not so clear cut, these false positives and false negatives, because say these problems are often defined politically. So they say there's too many, there's too much high impact crime with like a major negative impact on society, and it's often committed by a really small group of perpetrators. So we want to know who this small group of perpetrators is. Then the police sort of looks at their resources and say, oh, we have about the resources to look at take actions on 600 individuals. So then like the 600 is defined, and then they're like, oh, let's look at like previous crime data and sort of see what the characteristics of these individuals are and how we can sort of define this target group, and then how to legitimize the approach as well. And sort of like they say like sometimes a false positive is actually on this list, but it doesn't mean that this person doesn't have any problems. He might have been otherwise 650, because it's not like there's only 600 young adults with problems in the city. There's probably like 1,200 of them, but you have to narrow down to a certain amount. And then they're also aware of like false negatives, where they're saying like, we know there's like individuals who have a really long rap sheet, but they've been charged in the past with like different offenses that don't show up in our variables, and as such don't make it to the target group, whereas they should maybe make it to the target group. But if we change these variables or make exceptions, actually the legitimacy goes away. So the legitimacy of the entire approach sort of is questioned. So they're aware of these false positives and false negatives, but it's a very gray area because it is sort of more complex than just looking at the data and saying like, yes, here, yes, no. And it was interesting because also like, especially the Dutch police also acknowledged that these lists are often stigmatizing. So if you're on one of these lists, so if you're on the gang matrix, or if you're on the top 600, for instance, people know what these lists are. Like people have heard them in the corridors, read about them in the papers. So as soon as you get on this list, it's often like everybody in your environment is like, oh, you're like a really severe criminal, and you're like in the eyes of the state considered like high risk. So these lists are often stigmatizing also in the way they were framed, which the police say like is a political responsibility, which is quite interesting. So they sort of outsource the responsibility to another entity, and it can actually be very discriminatory, especially like the gang matrix is a very good example from it. Sort of here, like I think Williams and Clark said it the best way when they said like it creates constructed identities such as a gang member or a terrorist that sort of ties specific racialized communities to a complex process of criminalization. And here in the gang matrix, like ways to get on the gang matrix was like, if you were seen with somebody who was already on the gang matrix, if you showed up in the stop and search databases, but considering as sort of the stop and search based databases, like over police Black communities in London, it's not uncommon for like young Black men to show up on the stop and search databases several times. So actually for the gang matrix, they needed 2 variables to be included in it, which was quite easy to get if you belong to sort of a certain ethnic demographic. And then it was also impossible to get off this list. So there was somebody who was a social worker, a young Black social worker who worked with a lot of people on the gang matrix, and he was included on it. And it like I think to this day, he still hasn't been taken off. And these sort of lists, even if they are a combination sometimes of care and control, can be very punitive. So in the case of the gang matrix, they shared sort of who was on the gang matrix with schools, landlords, but also hospitals and other places. And sort of when you would go into these places, they would label you already as a gang member and treat you differently. So it has like a lot of real life impacts. And some of these programs don't really have positive ways of like getting out, so the care component is quite reduced. So they also like people like seriously acknowledge this within the police as well, but there's no clear-cut way forward. And I think we don't realize how sort of when we don't engage with the state that much, we don't understand what their force is and how they can actually dominate our lives. By sort of being on this list also means that there's additional money available for you, and that a range of public authorities actually engage in your life. And I mean, I already find it annoying to sometimes engage with the tax office, let alone all the other public institutions. And what I was very surprised about was that there's a reluctance in senior management to use it as well, because they said we are sort of the last frontier of the government. So if all other public institutions fail, we are there to sort of pick up the pieces. So then if we create sort of these risk scores, that then also means that if none of the other public institutions pick it up and something goes wrong, we will be the authority blamed because we saw it coming and we didn't take any actions. So there's like a lot of conflict around these lists, both internal and external. And I just wanted to end, I think, with one of my favorite art pieces, which is called White Collar Crime Risk Scores. And they sort of flipped the predictive policing logic to do financial crime. So they said, if we look at sort of data, where is financial crime most likely to take place? And you see like all of Manhattan is showing up, and these are where all the banks are located. And then they went to LinkedIn and they looked up what the profile of a person working in banks in these areas was, and you would get like it's to the left, a white man between 20 and 40, maybe a little bit overweight. And the nice part about it is that I think as soon as you flip the logic to a different type of crime type, the one that we might find more acceptable, and then think like all the actions that police take on high impact crime, for instance, would we also find them acceptable when we apply them to this target group, for instance? Like, would we find it acceptable for the police to stop them on the street on their way to work, to search through their bags, to confiscate their phone, to do like a whole range of things, to have like social services show up on their street, at their doorstep, to interview their kids? Like, there's a whole range of like actions that emerge once public authorities engage in your life. And I've asked these questions in workshops, and everybody was like, oh, no, that's not acceptable. But then why is it acceptable when it happens to a different crime type that belongs to sort of to a different part of our population? And so why I say that we have to look at context and it shapes the use of technology is that what I really see materializing is that sort of the social and political context sets police priorities, and especially at times of crisis. So either when events of high impact, like a terrorist attack or a murder, or sort of like an increase in robberies, or when it's like in the UK, there's a massive austerity cuts have happened in the last 10 years. And so the police mandate has expanded because other public authorities have also lost a lot of their budget. And the police has lost 25% of their budget, while the Home Office is saying, here, we have a pot of money for you to invest in sort of digital transformation. And that's why you see in the UK, there's far more sort of piloting and testing of technological projects on a short-term basis and buying things off the shelf that you don't see in the rest of Europe. And that really has to do with like financial incentives in a context of austerity. We also have to think about police cultures because, for instance, the Belgians refer to like the Anglo-Saxon police culture, but also to the Dutch, like, let's do it culture, or like, if it's not us, who will then be? And they're really like, this is really incentivizing the use of technology. And then culture also determines, like I said before, it's like buying off the shelf, developing in-house, which the Dutch do a lot, or developing with universities, which the Germans are known for. And we have to see that like all of this is happening on police infrastructures that really vary. Like in the UK, they're still using green screens, and there's huge silos of like databases. There's old data and biased data, wrong data. But all of these programs are happening on police infrastructures that really vary in maturity and sort of accuracy. So I think, yeah, we can look at the tool, but all of these things are shaping how these tools are being implemented, and also like how these tools are interacting sort of with society. So that's why I argue that we need to contextualize it within sort of the local context. And I think that's it. And then I did 40 minutes. Wait, let me stop sharing my screen. Yes. That was my talk.